welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you all are. It's still morning for us here in Hawaii. But yes, welcome again. We're so excited to have you folks for the New Counselor webinar series. This month, we'll be tackling an important topic that we all probably are in the midst of helping our students with, and will continue to do so, but counseling students with the financial need. I'm Leilani Arita Takayama. I'm a college counselor here at Iolani School in Hawaii. And we're so excited to see you folks to talk about this really important theme and topic. And yeah, we're so excited to get started. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. And so just a really quick note, we wanted to thank Compass for sponsoring the New Counselor webinar series. We also have a very special guest who's going to be imparting his wisdom in regards to financial aid, but I will let my fellow colleagues introduce him a little bit later in the topic. And I'm actually going to pass it on to my fellow faculty member, Curtis.
Thanks, Leilani. So happy to talk about financial aid, financial need. The very basics here, need-based aid. It is not sort of based solely on assets and income, on talents or achievements or interests. It's really what financial assistance might be necessary, just given off of the financial makeup of the family there. As you can see, limits awards to students who have demonstrated that they have the need for assistance through those government documentations or specific forms. Merit-based aid definition is, essentially is that thinking about an academic profile, an interest, specific scholarships tailoring to those achievements. The estimated family contribution, also known as the EFC, the amount of money that is said that families can sort of support in support yearly with that student enrolled at that institution. The total net cost ultimately is the bottom line, the bottom dollar there, subtracting the scholarships or grants from the overall cost of attendance. Some institutions have done a great job in detailing this on a final award notice. Other institutions, with some encouragement, are still working on that for our families. So with financial aid, what is needed? The FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. Studentaid.gov takes you to there. Encourage students, at least from my practice as a college counselor, encourage students and families to complete the FAFSA and submit it regardless of where they are on the spectrum of socioeconomic status. The CSS Profile, the College Scholarship Service, that is more tailored to private institutions, smaller institutions that are taking a deeper dive into the financial makeup of the family to see what assets are there and truly what might lead to, can argue, say, an appropriate expected family contribution. Institutional specific application, there are some institutions that require some more details or have their own sort of way of understanding how a family might qualify for grants and scholarships. 1040s, W-2s, those will be needed, encouraging families to have those accessible, have those available, trekking through this process. And then other document, another service is iDoc there, where it essentially collects the financial information and distributes them to schools.
Hey everyone, Tony Franco here, St. George's School. Thank you, Curtis. And so we're just going to kind of build a little bit upon what Curtis has spoken about here. In short, there are 3 different types of methodologies used by colleges. Not all colleges use, obviously, each of these. Many colleges will use one, right? So the federal methodology is that methodology through which the FAFSA is used primarily. And so again, it's best to encourage students and families to submit the FAFSA regardless of where they are on a socioeconomic status, especially if they are considering some version of financial need. And so many schools will, almost all schools look at, or all schools, not almost all schools will look at the FAFSA, right, to help determine some of that federal financial need. But then there are other schools that use kind of institutional methodology in order to determine that financial need, right? And that formula really mostly uses the CSS profile because it drills down into more information, more specific information for which the college or the university will grant specific dollars, right? And so, you know, as Curtis has mentioned, it's a real finite number of schools that require the CSS profile. Those are likely the schools that use the CSS formula to determine financial assistance. And then, of course, there are schools that will use some sort of hybrid or individual college formula to determine a financial aid package, right? So those schools are schools that naturally use both. And they take the information from both the FAFSA and the CSS, and then they use their own data and then thus formulate a financial aid package. And as Curtis has mentioned, some schools are better at this than others in somewhat determining and highlighting certain information. Recently, there was something put out, I believe, on the Chronicle of Education or Inside Higher Ed, kind of about this. 9 out of 10 schools actually don't do a good job at publishing this information uniformly. And so reading a financial aid package is also another skill set that you'll need to develop as a college counselor. And so when we think about these things, these are the basics, and we're going to move into some things that are a little bit more tricky. And so, we're going to go the other direction on the slides. Sorry. There we go. Excellent. Thank you. And so some of these trickier kind of situations are trying to understand some words or phrases that we've heard before, right? And so currently there are colleges who have the ability to make an admissions decision without regard to a family's ability to pay. And there are colleges that don't. And so the colleges that don't are need aware or need sensitive, meaning they will not make a decision on a student who requires a lot of financial assistance in a positive way, because they may or may not be able to fully fund that student. And so thus, another thing that we're talking about are schools that meet full need versus schools that gap, right? So schools that gap are schools that don't need the full demonstrated need of the applicant, right? And so sometimes when I'm talking to families, I like to remind families that demonstrated need is not perceived need, meaning demonstrated need is what you demonstrate to the colleges that you are able to pay as a family, not, well, we don't really want to pay $30,000 a year, so our number is 15. Well, if that's the case, then you probably need to apply to a certain subset of schools, particularly schools that are thinking about or allow for an opportunity for merit-based scholarships. So demonstrated need is what we're talking about in this idea of meaningful need. We're not talking about perceived need. And then last but not least, right, the most generous colleges here, there's probably only a list of 20 to 30, right? They do both, right? They meet full need and they don't have, they are not need aware, right? They are able to make admissions decisions without really any sort of regard to a family's ability to pay or not. And if the student needs the full freight, so to speak, that college will meet that student's full need. And so things get a little bit trickier later on. And there's obviously a lot of nuance here, and we'll dive a lot into that. But I'm going to pass it on to one of my colleagues now.
Awesome, thank you. So as you heard earlier in the presentation, Curtis talked about two phrases, right? Merit and need-based aid. And you're going to be hearing those phrases a lot throughout this process as students apply for financial aid. But just again, as a reminder, so merit aid is again aid awarded on testing or GPA or certain demographics, right? And it's not at all based on need. And so this is a list of colleges and universities that are known for providing merit money to students. And it's a list that's been developed over time because consistently we've observed that these schools provide that type of assistance to students. And I think that's just something that that's the type of knowledge that you're going to build over time, year after year, reviewing those financial aid packages. As Tony was saying, it's a skill you're going to have to develop, and you'll really be able to discern, okay, what type of aid is my kid getting? What are the schools that are known, right, for providing this type of aid? So, you know, obviously this list isn't all inclusive. And there might be some more information that we don't have about the applicants as far as why they got the merit aid. So it's really important that you, well, actually the student, double check the financial aid policies for each school. When they're doing their research on their college list, part of that research should also include looking at the financial aid websites and becoming familiar with who is in that office, right? I think a great time to learn about the type of aid that a college or university provides is during those campus visits in the fall. When you have those 5 or 10 minutes that you can meet with the rep, you can ask them, hey, what type of aid do you offer to your students? I've had lots of really great conversations, and I've learned, you know, about different awards that are offered every year. So I think that's a great time to start building your own internal list. And you know, if you're in a team setting, what might be really interesting is to build an internal list of schools locally that are known for providing merit aid, right? In California, I could tell you about all the schools in the Bay Area that would be really good with providing merit aid. And now that I'm, you know, I think 6 months in Texas, that's knowledge base that I'm still building. So maybe a fun exercise to do with your office. All right. And here are schools that provide 100% of that demonstrated interest, as Tony was talking about. Again, not all inclusive. And the way that they provide this need would be mostly through grants, scholarships, work studies, sometimes loans. And if they are loans, it's typically, right, the federally funded loans or the school-based loans. In recent years, as you've probably heard, the most selective schools have removed loans from their packages, but it might be that there are still loans in some need-based packages. Again, definitely check with their financial aid policies. Financial aid representatives do like talking with prospective students, and that is actually a really good teachable moment for kids in the process, is how to write that email to a financial aid representative, or how to pick up a phone and give them a call. I know I've sat with kids on the phone while they're talking with someone and asking their questions. So it could be a great teachable moment for them. Because schools, as you see here, that can meet 100% of that demonstrated need, because they tend to be more selective, it's important that the list has a range of schools, right? It just doesn't have just the schools that meet 100% of need, but also some that provide merit money, that there's just a range of both selectivity levels as well as types of need offered. So just something else to consider as you're helping your students put those lists together. All right, so now I'd like to introduce Chad Spencer, our special guest, who currently serves as a Senior Associate Dean of Admission and Financial Aid and Director of Financial Aid at Davidson. He has been a wonderful resource for families over the years when we partnered with him at Menlo School. And as you heard earlier, he has graciously offered our invitation to speak with all of us so we could learn from all of his expertise. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Chad.
Great, thank you, Bea. Happy to be here and was thrilled to be given the invitation or offered the invitation to speak today. We are T-minus 8 days from our early Decision 1 release date at Davidson. So we're getting excited as we're working through the pool of amazing applicants this year. And our financial aid team is just beginning to stir back to life since it's been quite a run since last summer when we worked through the awarding of our returning students. Just to share a little bit of background with you all, I've worked at Davidson for the last 17 years. And prior to that, I spent 7 years at my alma mater, a little place called Lenorine College, tucked away in the foothills of North Carolina. I'm from Chicago originally. That was a long time ago. I've been in North Carolina since I was a 17-year-old. So this is definitely home for me. I have a college-age son who's a senior right now who will be home in 2 days from Sewanee, University of the South, as he moves towards his 8th and better be final semester there. So I've lived this from the parent side of it, and my wife and I also have a high school senior, so we're in the thick of it with him as well. I just share that because oftentimes as I'm giving these presentations within a high school setting, then I think that allows parents to understand, right? I can relate with where they are, and I like to share some anecdotes and stories, and maybe I'll do a little bit of that today. But let me say, Curtis, Tony, Bea, you all did a great job in presenting and setting that foundation for those who are tuned in as they think about this financial aid process. And I couldn't agree more with the statements about the need for high school counselors to be conversant in this stuff, because you all are on the front lines. You're working with students first, oftentimes with families who've had no exposure to this whatsoever. So how in the world can we possibly expect them to be prepared to navigate a process that can be difficult at best, right? And just extremely intimidating, and unfortunately sometimes a barrier to entry for some students. Also know that those of you out there in your schools right now, if you have programming needs, my friends at Davidson and I are happy to work with you and your communities to give presentations, whether they're virtual like this one, or they're actually in person, which I love the in-person opportunities, but I also get that it's a little easier for us to zoom into calls than it is for everyone to show up to one place at one time. So let me put that plug out there as something we're willing to do. But what I want to do is build upon what's already been shared, and I'll present 7 or 8 slides. We may spend 25 minutes or so working through these. So I hope that you'll be able to gain what you need in order to continue that progression of learning about financial aid. What I'm presenting on this slide is this simple equation used to determine a student's financial need for one academic year. So I think the statement was made earlier by Curtis that this is an annual process, and it is. So every year there's a determination of a student's calculated financial need, taking all of that data that's submitted within the FAFSA and or the CSS profile, and colleges use their own methodologies, their own formulas in some cases, especially those of us who collect the CSS profile, to calculate the student's financial need each year. We begin with the cost of education. We know that to be variable. I share with families, every college has a cost of education, but we sure as heck don't have the same cost of education. So we have to start with that total sticker price. Then we subtract the expected family contribution, but also too, it's important for them to know that if the student has resources coming from outside of the college or university, those are considered outside resources, usually outside scholarships, and those two will be subtracted from the total cost of attendance as we consider a student's financial need for the year. So let's move forward and we'll break this equation down by each component with the next few slides. Here's the cost of education, and I think it's important to understand the components of the total cost of education. Of course, all of us charge tuition and fees, so that's going to be directly billable. And that happens at the beginning of each term, whether it's semesters, quarters, whatever. So tuition and fees, direct expense. Room and board for those students who are living on campus. Of course, there will be a room and board expense associated with their attendance. Just for your understanding, we will begin next year, and by we, I mean colleges and universities, be required to refer to room and board as food and housing, which I think is a really good thing as we think about people understanding with clarity what we're talking about. So I have found that board is not something always understood. So when giving presentations, I'll share with people, board refers to food. It's a meal plan. So room and board, food and housing, call it what you will. If the student's purchasing a meal plan, and if they're living on campus, of course, they'll pay the college or university directly for those room and board, food and housing expenses. If a student chooses to live off campus, then room and board, food and housing is going to be an indirect expense. So it'll shift from the direct line to an indirect line, and someone else will be paid for those expenses. The apartment complex and students around Davidson love to eat cookout, so they're probably spending quite a bit of their dollars on cookout and Waffle House here in the South. So that can become an indirect expense. Books and supplies, students are going to need to make those purchases somewhere. They're not always in our bookstores. We understand that. They're pretty discerning consumers, so they're going to find the cheaper alternatives, but books and supplies are going to cost something, so we include in the total cost of attendance an allowance for those purchases. Transportation expenses. You guys are all over the country. I'm sure your students are heading to places throughout the country as well. If they're having to board an airplane multiple times each year, their transportation expenses are going to add up much more quickly than for the student who chooses to attend college closer to home. So we're going to include an allowance for transportation, often based upon where it is the student's coming from. And miscellaneous personal expenses. I think oftentimes families fail to think about their students' need for funds to use for things outside of kind of their traditional college going expenses. So colleges will include an allowance that may equate to a couple of $100s a month built into the total cost of education to allow students to live a standard college going student existence on and around the campus. You know, on my campus, we include in the tuition and fees structure nearly every activity available to students. They can go to athletic events, they can go to arts related events, they can participate in other activities on campus without having to pay additional fees. But we also want students to be able to live a life outside of our campus. So in the greater Charlotte area, they can engage with their peers if they have some funding available to them. So at Davidson, we include a couple of $100s a month. In other places where cost of living may be much higher, they may choose to include a greater allowance for miscellaneous personal expenses. But these are the 5 standard components that students are going to encounter regardless of where they choose to attend college. Next slide, please. Outside resources can be beneficial for students, as you know, if students apply for scholarships or if they're receiving an outside resource based upon their individual circumstances. Oftentimes, these resources can replace or reduce student loans or work study that's built into a financial aid awards package. And in cases where there's gapping, I think Curtis touched upon gapping, maybe it was Tony. Many colleges gap because they simply don't have the resources to meet 100% of calculated need for all students. So in cases where there's a gap and a student brings an outside scholarship or outside resource with them, it can help to close that gap down. And in cases where students are awarded a merit-only award, so a scholarship for some amount less than the total cost of attendance, very often an outside resource can be stacked on top of or added to that merit scholarship award. So further than reducing the cost the family has to pay in order to send their student there. And ultimately, there is a hard ceiling, that is the total cost of attendance. So regardless of the source of financial aid, in combination, the aid cannot be greater than the total cost of attendance. So simply put, and sometimes those are really difficult conversations to have with students because in many cases, they've done the work to earn the financial aid that they've been awarded or they're bringing with them. But federally speaking, we are not allowed to award aid beyond the total cost of attendance at our institutions. Here we have the components of the expected family contribution. And you can see how I've broken them out here into 4 individual components. For the parent, income and assets. For the student, also income and assets may be contributing factors as we're generating the contribution. I can tell you that in my experience, most students going to college directly out of high school, so that traditional 18-year-old, has not earned enough income in their time in high school, didn't have opportunity to work enough to generate income to the point where there's much of a contribution being generated by their income or their earnings. So my experience tells me I expect most students to generate either 0 contribution from their income or very little. Students will report any assets they have in their own names, savings accounts, checking accounts, investments in some cases where the student's actually the owner. When the student owns the asset, then the assets will be assessed at a 20 to 25% rate. So for every $1,000 students have in assets, 200 to 250 of the 1,000 will become a part of the expected family contribution. Parents often sit up and listen closely as we talk about assets and the assessment rates. And we'll talk about 529 and other college savings plans in just a minute. Parent assets, the first thing to know is that their retirement accounts are off limits for financial aid purposes. So the principal balances of 401ks, 403bs, IRAs, anything that's a traditional retirement account will be excluded from the financial aid calculation. So that's great news for families. However, just like the student, they'll report the value of their non-retirement assets. For parent assets, there are allowances made against their total assets for things like emergencies in the household, or if they have other children, younger children in the household, a portion of their assets are protected for educational expenses. So based upon what's left over after allowances are made, approximately 5% of the parent's discretionary net worth will become a part of the expected family contribution. So if families ever come to you saying, you know, our assets are really driving up our expected family contribution, in the overwhelming majority of cases, that's simply not true, because most Americans do not have enough non-retirement assets available to actually generate much in the way of a contribution. And for those who do, they tend to be very well resourced, and therefore there's going to be the expectation that they contribute some portion of those assets towards their students' college expenses. And then finally, when it comes to parent income, for most families, this is where the bulk of the expected family contribution is coming from. It's from income, and it's based upon adjusted gross income plus any untaxed income that the family reports for the tax year. For current seniors, they're reporting 2021 tax data. So adjusted gross income plus untaxed income equals total income. And then there are allowances for things like federal taxes paid, state taxes paid. There's an income protection allowance based upon the size of the family that allows for housing and food and paying the standard expenses that families encounter. What remains after the allowances are applied is considered available income, and then a percentage of that parental income will become a part of the expected family contribution. It tends to range between 20% or so and the upper 40s. Those with greater levels of available income are going to be assessed at a higher rate, and therefore a larger portion of their available income will become a part of the expected family contribution. That's how it all comes together. 529 and other college savings plans. I include a separate slide to address these plans because I have found that this is where there tends to be error in reporting by families as they're applying for financial aid. And really the message I try to get across is the college savings plan is to be reported as an asset, and it's to be reported as the asset of the plan owner, which more often than not, in fact, far more often than not, is not the students. It tends to be parents who own college savings plans, and then the student is the beneficiary. So if that's the case, then parents should be reporting the asset as their own when applying for financial aid, which means that much lower 5% assessment rate will be applied against that asset rather than the much higher 20 to 25% assessment rate for student assets. And dropping down to the bottom of the slide here, the last bullet point, in cases where someone other than the student or parent owns the college savings plan, then that college savings plan value is not reported when the student's applying for financial aid. Let's use grandparents as an example. They decide to start a college savings plan for their grandchild. We are not assessing the grandparents' ability to pay for college. So they're not reporting the value of that plan on the FAFSA and or the CSS profile. However, if once the student is enrolled in college, the grandparents make a distribution from the plan they own to the students, then in a future year when the student's reapplying for financial aid, they will report that distribution as having been received, and it will be treated just like income in this process. So it'll be in a future year that the student may have to report something related to a college savings plan owned by someone other than themselves or a parent. All right, on to the next slide, please. What about merit-based scholarships? You all know the deal with merit-based aid. I mean, it was presented really well by B. Ultimately, I feel like families need to understand, though, not every college offers merit-based scholarships. And in some cases, even those who do offer a limited number of them. As you know, the more selective an institution, the less likely they are to offer merit-based scholarships. And so the position in the higher ed marketplace often is dictates whether or not colleges are going to offer merit aid. It boils down to allocation of resources and your philosophy. You know, I love the philosophy of we're going to make our institution accessible to as many students as possible, regardless of their ability to pay. Well, I feel like to some degree, merit-based scholarshiping kind of goes against that philosophy. But colleges are rewarding those things they hope most to attract to their campus. So I send people out on homework assignments when I give these presentations, and I tell them, do your research to understand whether or not a college offers merit-based scholarships. If they do offer it, figure out what it is they're rewarding and whether or not the student may be able to exhibit some of those things or demonstrate ability in areas that are being rewarded. And then finally understand the procedures for consideration. Must the student complete a separate scholarship application? Do they have to be nominated? Is it actually the admission application that serves as the merit scholarship application? So they need to do all of that work. to figure that stuff out. And then as the student applies for merit-based scholarships or just for admission, I share that, for one, successful candidates present well-crafted, thoroughly completed admission applications. They do demonstrate an interest in the colleges where they're pursuing those merit-based awards, however that has to happen. And nowadays there's 100 different ways to demonstrate interest. They're authentic and they're genuine. I'm always asked, as I'm sure you all are, how do I distinguish myself within an applicant pool of thousands of students, all very talented? Well, it's by being exactly who you are, because that's what we want to know, who you are. We're really not interested in knowing who you're not. So be genuine and authentic. And then finally, and this is where I'm trying to communicate the message in my own household to my own kid, which is keep challenging yourself all the way to the finish line, like not just through first semester, right? All the way to the end, because colleges are paying attention, especially as they're making merit-based scholarship decisions, sometimes as late as March and April. And if students are awarded merit-based scholarships, especially, but I think too, there should be some questions asked about athletic scholarships. Lead with, is the scholarship renewable? If the answer is yes, then what exactly are the requirements? Must the student maintain a minimum GPA? Must they live on campus? Must they complete a minimum number of community service hours? What is it exactly the student must do in order to renew each year? And then also, I think it's a wise idea to ask if need-based aid eligibility will be impacted. It may not, but if it's going to be, then you're going to want to know how. So it may be that a merit-based scholarship replaces loans, replaces work, and then reduces need-based grant eligibility. Or maybe it's simply lumped on top of the other things a student perhaps is already eligible for based upon their calculated financial need. And then the responses colleges may give may lead families or students to ask additional questions. And finally, and this is my last slide, this is where I hope to illustrate some of the differences in the ways in which colleges award financial aid. Unfortunately, I believe that a decision is made based upon sticker price, and then that may eliminate a college that could be the perfect fit for the student and may actually be very affordable for them. And so that list that was shared earlier by B of colleges and universities that meet 100% of financial need, I think almost without exception, they all have extraordinary high sticker prices. And so if that's all a family sees or a student sees, then they may choose not to explore those options. So I put this in front of people, hoping that they'll understand that they really do need to work towards, like Curtis said, the bottom line understanding. Like, what is it actually going to cost to send the student there? So if we look at each of these institutions individually, and we start at Davidson, we see a $75,400 cost of attendance. Extraordinarily high, right? A $20,000 EFC, which is the one constant on this slide. So we're assuming here that we've all collected the same data and we've applied the same formula. So of course, then the result will be the same. And while that's not always going to be true, not all colleges are going to calculate the same exact EFC. For this exercise, it just simply makes it easier. At Davidson, $55,400 in need is a high need student, but this is not extreme need. The student's not eligible for federal aid programs, at least grant programs. They're not eligible for state grant programs if they're a North Carolinian either. So how does Davidson meet need? Well, we meet 100% of need. We guarantee that. We're not going to consider a family's ability to pay either when making an admission decision, and we don't award loans as a part of our need-based packaging model. We do award work study to all of our incoming students. Right now, it's $2,500 work award. Students can earn $11 an hour minimum and work 8 to 10 hours a week and easily earn that $2,500 over the course of 2 semesters. Then we award grant aid to meet the need that remains. So in this case, $52,900 in grant aid awarded, bringing us to a total aid award of $55,400, which means 100% of need has been met. We ask the family to pay the expected family contribution. If we'd calculated a $40,000 EFC for this student, then we would expect the student and family to pay a $40,000 EFC. If we move over to the public university, we see need of $15,000, which is less than half of the total cost of attendance. So this is absolutely not a high need students. They're in the middle ranges. We see $0 in merit-based aid, and we see a combination of grant, loan, and work study. That loan amount of $5,500 is equal to a first-year, first-time college-going student's borrowing eligibility through the federal Stafford Loan Program. They must complete a FAFSA in order to be eligible for the federal Stafford Loan Program. And they're guaranteed that $5,500 amount should they choose to utilize it. Total aid here is $15,000. So again, 100% of need is met. There's no gap. And the family will pay the $20,000 EFC, and the student will repay the loan and the interest later. In the case of the other private university here, we see a $57,000 cost of attendance. So around the average for a four-year private right now, $37,000 in need. We're seeing a merit-based scholarship for the first time. As you all know better than anyone, oftentimes merit scholarships are awarded at the point of admission notification, particularly by those institutions who have a rolling admission process. And in the case of a $20,000 merit award being awarded ahead of the rest of the financial aid package being communicated, well, when the rest of it is communicated, the merit scholarship will remain. And it may be that the student also receives some level of grant funding, in this case, $4,500. We see again the $5,500 loan, a $2,000 job for total aid of $32,000 for the year, meaning there's a gap in the aid award. So despite there being a $20,000 merit award, full need has not been met, and this family must pay $25,000, and the student will repay the loan and the interest later. I've used the $5,000 example of a gap here. We know that there are gaps much greater than $5,000 in student financial aid packages, often that may make an institution inaccessible to them, or may put the family in a really difficult place when it comes to making decisions about what's healthy for their financial future. So as they think about borrowing, I often caution families to really think long and hard about things like parent loans, where they may be taking on more debt than they can repay. And I like to liken parent loans to things like Big Macs, right? We know we shouldn't do it. You're going to feel awful if you do. So you should probably leave them alone, if at all possible, and instead allow the students to first take advantage of the Stafford Loan Program, where there are limits in place, where the student can't borrow more than $27,000 over the course of their four-year undergraduate experience. And that way, the student and the family don't end up buried in debt as the student finishes their undergraduate experience. Those are my comments. Thank you for allowing me to make them. I hope you all have taken a lot from it. And if moving forward there are additional questions for me, I'm happy to respond.
I actually have a question for Chad. I know that you're a test optional institution and you're also a merit school. I wonder, based on your experience and also with your peers as well, when a student decides to not submit testing, does that affect the merits at all, or that just really depends on different institution? And we have heard mixed answers. I just want to hear from you and your experience in the field.
Yeah, that's a good question, Jane. So I can speak for Davidson only, and I can tell you that the absence of a test score has no negative impact on the merit consideration. Now, we're a place that offers merit scholarships to about 5% of the incoming class. So it's a very small slice of the incoming class each year, but test scores play no role in our decision-making related to merit scholarships.
Thank you.
I have a question, Chad. What is your best advice when we are maybe working or talking to families who have special circumstances that come up in terms of after they apply for financial aid and they want maybe a reconsideration, or I don't know if every other school is seeing this, but sometimes families like to comparison shop and they say, well, this school offered me this. I wonder if I could call Davidson and see if they could bump it up to that same amount. Best advice on, what we might be able to tell families or parents when they come in and ask either of those questions.
Yeah, good question, Chad. And if I had a full hour today, I would have included slides on both of those points. One is, what if my circumstances change? And that's an important question for people to understand how to answer. And my best advice is always make contact with the financial aid office. So someone made the point of financial aid officers actually do, at least some of us do, enjoy contact with families and students. And we want to answer questions because we're part of the enrollment team. And we understand we want to meet the needs of families. So if circumstances change, communicate and understand what's required in order for a reevaluation to occur. A lot of times people call it an appeal, and that's fine. I view it as a reevaluation because something has to have changed. So truly, circumstances have to have changed. It can't be, I don't agree with my calculated expected family contribution, because I don't meet many people who agree with their expected family contribution, right? That's a different conversation. And that may turn into the, will you negotiate my aid award? Which I can say, no, we won't. We meet 100% of need, period. But I have many of my peers and counterparts elsewhere will engage in some level of negotiation or price matching or aid matching, I guess. So if families want to ask the question, they can. I just encourage them to not be offended if the answer is simply no, that's not something we are able to do. Anything else? All right, well, thank you for hanging out this afternoon or this morning in some cases and allowing me to join you guys. And please do keep in mind that we're happy at Davidson to provide for your needs. So I'm going to put into the chat my email address. So as you think about your programming for spring or even as far out as next fall, if you want to send me an email, we have a form that we've developed that allows counselors to make a request for one of our staff to provide for financial aid programming. So we're happy to make that available to you via email, so you can make that request as you think about what your calendar is going to look like moving forward. All right, thanks everyone. So with that, I'm out of here. Good luck, happy holidays, and yeah, good luck as decisions are coming down.
Thanks, Chad.
All right, bye.
Before everyone signs off, we'll send out the presentation that has like resources on the back end of the presentation. People are beginning to sign off, so we won't get to those now, but there are some resources that we will share out with our recording. So please be sure to take a look at those.
I'm sorry, can I jump in and just ask a question?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
I was wondering if there's like a living document that we use for merit schools and scholarship school. I don't know if anyone has ever developed something like that. So I thought I'd just toss it out there because it's a project our school is trying to create. I'm not sure if there exists one.
I know, like, we have one for like schools that I think like we know of, like in the that our students apply to, but I don't know if there's like one that has like a nationwide thing. I don't have access to that. One of the other faculty members may know of something that's out there.
Right. Yeah, I don't think I've seen one shared across ACCIS, but at least in our office, we have sort of developed an internal one. Sorry, Curtis, I sound like you're about to say something too.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say the same thing. It might be one on our listserv they can search for, but yeah, I can't think of anything more current.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we're also developing one, so just want to know if there's already something that living among all of us. So thank you.
Yeah.
I think just one more strategy as well. I really would like to implement this with our junior class, but I'm planning, we'll see what happens, but I'm planning like a kind of a research Excel or research sheet in Google. And one of the categories that I do want to add is like, what kind of merit scholarship programs does this institution offer? And I think hopefully as all your students are information gathering, then you can also compile. I think the other note is that it really depends on the student base that you have, your student population, what's kind of like their story. But there are certain programs where I'm like, okay, student is applying to Redlands. Like I know that there's actually a lot of merit scholarships that benefit our students. I don't know what it looks like across other demographics or other schools, but that could be something really interesting. I think we all know about like USC, for example, those merit deadlines and their new EA program or deadline. But even like BU is another popular institution that our students have. And that's something that like always pops up in my memory, but that could be something helpful for you folks as well as we move forward with the next class.
Yeah, and I also think that sorry, is another thought, sort of small liberal arts schools that might be on that list, being generous with merit scholarships. There's just a range of money, and like it's specific to a student that it sort of fits and make it, sort of viable for families. So capturing that data, I think, would be hard, generally speaking, across ACCIS, but internally in your office for your student demographic is probably the most appropriate. Just as I can think about students on my caseload that would be competitive for merit at the same institution, and that still be a range of figures.
And I'm just going to jump in here real quickly. I would add on to all that because I agree with a lot of that. And I would also say that if there were to be a list, which I'm sure there probably is somewhere, we just can't come up with it off the top of our heads. I do think, Jane, your endeavor of culling and creating a list today by today's standards is much more of a efficient policy, despite how much of a mountain you're probably seemingly climbing right now. Any sort of list pre-pandemic is null and void at this point, and especially in a test optional landscape. So I just think, like, I realize that you're probably like, man, I wish I could stand on the shoulders of someone who's done this work before. And I would agree with you. And I also think creating a list by 2021, 2022 standards is probably a best office practice moving forward, because anything pre-pandemic might not be applicable.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
That's a really great point, Tony. Any other questions? Well, we have you for 6 more minutes. All righty. Well, we don't want to belabor the point, and we know that you all are busy. We are all counting down the days till break. So we want to wish you a happy holidays. The information will be sent out in another email, and we hope to see you at our next webinar in January. Have a great morning, afternoon.